On December 14, 1972, astronaut Eugene Cernan climbed the ladder of the Lunar Module Challenger, took one last look across the gray plains of the Taurus-Littrow Valley, and became the last human being to stand on the surface of the moon. He didn't know it at the time, but more than 50 years would pass before another person would even attempt to follow in his footsteps. For a species that had just proven it could cross 250,000 miles of empty space and walk on another world, that's an almost unbelievable silence. So what happened? Why did NASA, after 6 successful crewed landings, simply stop going? The answer isn't a single dramatic event. It's a slow collision of politics, money, public boredom, and a change in what going to the moon was actually supposed to prove. Here's the real story of why humanity turned its back on the moon for half a century. To understand why the Apollo program ended, you first have to understand why it started, and it had almost nothing to do with science. In 1961, the United States was losing the space race badly. The Soviet Union had already launched the first satellite, Sputnik, and then followed it up by putting the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. American confidence was shaken to its core. President John F. Kennedy needed a way to demonstrate, unambiguously, that the United States could outbuild and outthink the Soviet Union, and he needed a goal so audacious that the Soviets would struggle to catch up. Landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth fit perfectly. It was a political and technological chess move disguised as a scientific mission. That distinction matters enormously because it means the entire Apollo program was funded and justified as a race, not as the beginning of a permanent human presence beyond Earth. Once the race was won, the primary reason for spending that kind of money quietly disappeared with it. At its peak, the Apollo program consumed roughly 4% of the entire United States federal budget. Adjusted for inflation, the full program cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 to $180 billion in today's money. For comparison, NASA's entire annual budget today is a small fraction of that as a share of federal spending. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, and contractors across the country worked around the clock to make each mission possible, and every single Saturn V rocket that thundered off the launch pad was effectively a one-time use, multi-hundred-million-dollar machine that fell into the ocean in pieces. That kind of spending was tolerable to the American public and to Congress as long as it was tied to beating the Soviets to a finish line. But once Neil Armstrong's boot print was in the lunar dust, the urgency evaporated almost overnight. Lawmakers began asking an uncomfortable question. If we've already proven we can do this, why do we need to keep doing it, especially at this price? While NASA engineers were solving problems no one had ever solved before, the United States was also pouring enormous resources into the Vietnam War, a conflict that grew more expensive and more politically divisive with every passing year. At the same time, President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were expanding the social safety net, funding everything from healthcare to housing to civil rights initiatives. Congress could not indefinitely fund a war overseas, a growing welfare state at home, and a space program that cost billions of dollars a year without something eventually being cut. Space exploration, however historic, doesn't produce the kind of immediate, visible relief that a struggling family or a returning soldier needs. It became an easy target for budget hawks looking to trim federal spending, and by the late 1960s, funding cuts to NASA had already begun, even before Apollo 11 ever left the launch pad. Most people don't realize that Apollo 11 wasn't originally supposed to be the final chapter, or even close to it. NASA had planned missions all the way up to Apollo 20, with ambitions that stretched into extended lunar stays, dedicated geological expeditions, and even the potential construction of a small lunar outpost. But as budgets shrank year after year, NASA was forced to cancel missions one by one. Apollo 20 was cut first, its hardware repurposed. Then Apollo 18 and 19 followed, their Saturn V rockets eventually ending up as museum displays instead of vehicles that carried astronauts to another world. By the time Apollo 17 launched in December of 1972, it wasn't the triumphant culmination of a long-term plan. It was simply the last mission NASA could afford to fly, before the entire program was shut down. Here's something that tends to surprise people. By the time of Apollo 13 in 1970, television networks had already scaled back their live coverage of lunar missions. The first landing was appointment viewing for the entire planet, with hundreds of millions of people glued to their screens. But by the third or fourth trip to the same gray, airless rock, the astonishment had worn off. Astronauts driving a lunar rover across the moon's surface, however genuinely remarkable, simply didn't generate the same ratings as a live moonwalk broadcast for the very first time. Ironically, it took a near disaster to bring the public's attention back. When Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded en route to the moon in April of 1970, the entire country suddenly cared again, glued to their radios and televisions as NASA engineers worked around the clock to bring 3 astronauts home alive. The mission became one of the most celebrated rescue stories in American history, but it also planted a chilling and very real question in the minds of both the public and Congress. How long could NASA keep sending people to the moon before their luck finally ran out? Every single Apollo mission carried an enormous, unspoken risk. Astronauts were sitting atop a controlled explosion equivalent to a small tactical weapon, traveling through a vacuum with no atmosphere to protect them, relying on systems that had never been tested under the exact conditions they'd face in deep space. NASA had already suffered one horrific tragedy in January 1967, when a cabin fire during a launch pad test killed all 3 astronauts of Apollo 1 before the mission even left the ground. Apollo 13's near catastrophe was a stark reminder that even a wildly successful, meticulously engineered program was one mechanical failure away from turning triumph into tragedy on live television. As missions continued and public enthusiasm faded, NASA administrators and government officials increasingly weighed a difficult truth: the political cost of losing astronauts on a mission that fewer and fewer people were watching started to outweigh the benefit of continuing to fly them. President Richard Nixon, who took office in 1969, inherited the Apollo program rather than championing it the way Kennedy had. Nixon was far more interested in building a reusable spacecraft that could dramatically lower the cost of reaching orbit, a vehicle that would eventually become the space shuttle. In his view, continuing to spend fortunes flying expendable rockets to a location the United States had already conquered made far less sense than investing in the infrastructure for long-term, cost-effective access to space closer to home. In 1972, the same year Apollo 17 flew its final mission, Nixon formally approved the Space Shuttle program. From that point forward, NASA's priorities and its budget shifted decisively away from the moon and toward low Earth orbit, where the shuttle and later the International Space Station would dominate the agency's attention for the next 4 decades. Unlike future missions that might target the moon for mining resources, testing technology for Mars, or establishing a long-term research base, the original Apollo missions had already accomplished their core objective. Scientifically, the missions had returned hundreds of pounds of lunar rock and soil samples, deployed seismometers, and gathered enough data to keep geologists busy analyzing lunar history for decades. There was no obvious follow-up experiment considered urgent enough to justify the enormous cost of another crewed landing, especially when uncrewed probes could gather additional scientific data at a tiny fraction of the price. Without a clear, compelling reason tied to national security, economic opportunity, or scientific necessity, and without a rival nation threatening to get there first, there simply wasn't the political will to keep funding lunar missions that had already made their point emphatically. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking parts of this story involves the astronauts themselves. Several members of NASA's astronaut corps had trained for years, in some cases for the entirety of their careers, specifically to walk on the moon, only to have their missions canceled before they ever got the chance. Talented, highly trained pilots and scientists who had passed every test imaginable found themselves grounded permanently, their dream quietly erased by a budget line item. Some transitioned to work on the Skylab space station or later the Space Shuttle program, but for many, the door to the lunar surface closed forever, and it never reopened during their lifetimes. For decades, sending humans back to the moon simply wasn't a serious conversation inside NASA. The agency's focus shifted to the Space Shuttle, then to building and maintaining the International Space Station in partnership with other nations. It wasn't until growing interest in Mars exploration, renewed geopolitical competition with countries like China, and the rise of private spaceflight companies that lunar missions crept back onto the agenda. Today, NASA's Artemis program is explicitly designed to return astronauts to the lunar surface, this time with the stated goal of establishing a sustainable, long-term presence rather than simply planting another flag and coming home. Unlike Apollo, Artemis is framed as a stepping stone toward eventually sending humans to Mars, using the moon as a proving ground for the technology, life support systems, and mission planning that a journey to another planet would require. The story of why NASA stopped going to the moon isn't a story about running out of ideas or losing interest in space. It's a story about how quickly the priorities of a nation can shift once a specific political goal has been achieved. Apollo was never really a science program wearing a rocket-shaped costume. It was a demonstration of national capability, born from Cold War anxiety, sustained by public fascination, and ultimately abandoned once both the fear and the fascination faded. For over 50 years, the footprints left behind by 12 astronauts remained the only human marks on another world, undisturbed in the airless vacuum, waiting. It took a new generation of engineers, a new set of geopolitical rivalries, and an entirely new vision for what a return to the moon could accomplish before humanity was finally ready to go back. The question now isn't really why NASA stopped, it's whether this time, having learned the lessons of Apollo, the return will actually stick.